I don't have Slack open. Were there any questions that came along for the exercise? I should have checked ahead of time.
I don't see any.
Awesome, thank you.
Wait, there might be one. No.
This is do you want the date time stamps within the debug arguments, or as long as we come into the same solution?
It's the same question I had.
My hope was they would be here, that I could type in date stamps here.
Okay.
Is that the question?
I think so. Let's see.
There are a lot of people here who did.
There's another way too. You can put a breakpoint on like line 10 there, and you can set arcs as they come in if you wanted to.
Yeah, I will show that.
Say there's another way. That's how I always
Sure.
do it. I do in the command window. I like pop them in there.
Yeah.
Yeah. So maybe do that. Maybe do that when you start back up, and that'll answer his question.
Okay. Well, the stream is started, and we have everybody here. So
All right.
I'm ready when they are.
My solution does not seem to work.
Does it at least run?
No.
Okay. So it's got red squigglies somewhere?
No. No, it doesn't.
Yeah, that's code. You have to put in like the actual like strings of a date, like a string version of a date. Yeah, that'll work.
Who wants to do that?
Mm-hmm.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Can you
Oh, I have an idea.
stay in alpha and then make a new space?
What do you mean by new space? New project? Like a new
I
console?
want to delete this.
Gotcha. I'm going to cover that. We had someone else who...
Okay.
Yeah, I probably should have mentioned that earlier. Because I keep deleting stuff, but it occurs to me that I'm sort of removing all the stuff we're learning as I'm going. Like Pac-Man, I'm eating it up as soon as I create it. Yeah, I'll mention that.
You start typing it, and then you timestamp the ABs, and then in parentheses that'll take a string. So now it'll different.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now just do it dots. So it's hard to and so now it's like, okay, do you want days? Like it'll actually like help you. So you might put your days there or something like that. Yeah.
One of the hardest things about
semicolon kind of at the end. And you'll see how it's like checking the individual type. It's really helpful. Once you get used to that, once you get used to it, like checking manually, it's like before you even compile it.
I know.
Hours is going to be like the difference between total hours.
That's actually the hardest part. That's not the hardest part.
And it'll show you the difference.
Not sticking everything that matters.
It'll
I hit F5. I always hit F5.
show you what it means.
Yeah. I love comparing them to
That should give you like days 4.4.
I just felt like the right note. How did you know? Same sort of thing.
Help us get into the group.
I'm trying. So I do something that I didn't explain very
Oh, put those in.
That's what happened when we,
See if it helps if you put them in quotes. Like this, like strings. That helps. It may be kind of confused.
Yeah.
All right, they can see.
Good. They can see something. Now they see it. Cool. So just here in Richmond, just a show of hands. Could I see who believes that they probably succeeded? They've got something that they're happy with. All right, that's a good number. That's a really good number. All right. So as I said, that actually was not on my list of exercises. I just sort of made that one up. Let me just do it in front of you here real quick. So the very first thing is, my style is I like to start with, make sure I'm streaming, good. what are the inputs, what are the outputs? Well, the inputs, let me go ahead and put in some data that matters. The format will matter. You do need to put in something that's tolerable to the computer. Hopefully I'll type it correctly the first time. So we'll do the example I said. So we'll do tomorrow. I'll do 8 a.m. As the oh, it's all space separated. I didn't think of that. That makes it tougher.
Yeah, you may have to do string. You may have to do quotes. I don't know. I'm not sure how.
Let me see if I can. Let me see if it'll interpret that. This will be fun because you might see me fail the first time I try this, which would be good. And you'll see how I recover from that. Because all that's part of the active debugging. That's part of what I'm trying to show today. So that's good. So it's very similar to our integer adding, right? So let's quickly. I'll use the date time for parsing. We'll parse each one of those out. Addition. C#, by the way, is very case sensitive. So if I do date time with a lowercase t, it doesn't recognize that. So do be aware of that. So I cannot do that. What I can do is this. This is also an exercise I noticed as I walked around the room. There were a lot of solutions that were good, that people were on, that were wildly different. That's normal in C#. There are multiple ways to get this particular task done. I'm actually going to reverse these arguments. I'm using the subtract operator as my first attempt. I may stick with that, I may not. We will find out. So what I decided to do as my first attempt here, I'm doing this live in front of you, I'm going to parse the first one and I'm going to subtract the second one. Yes, I'm using a subtract operator. I didn't tell you that yet, but subtract operator does work for more than just integers. Just like the plus sign works for more than just integers, it works for strings. So I can do the subtract. If I mouse over result, I get the type, the actual data type of result is time span. So this immediately tells you there must be some sort of special time span type in the language. I'm going to use a breakpoint, and let's see if it parses. If it doesn't parse, then I may have to do a cheesier solution here. Maybe I got it right. You'll notice I used the breakpoint. I wanted to know if it would parse. If it had not parsed, and I'll break it in a second, you'll see, I'll show you how exceptions work. Exceptions are what happens when the program fails catastrophically. But I can mouse over the result and actually can see that its value is 1 hour, so I'm already on the right path. Let's see if I like how it prints out. That actually is pretty good. That's hours, minutes, seconds. So I consider the exercise complete. So I actually did...
I'm sorry, can we see your debugger?
Yep. Oh yeah. I'm going to show you many things. I'm not finished.
Right.
This was my first attempt. I'm doing this live in front of you. I did not practice this particular exercise myself. But now that I've got it in a state that I'm happy, I'll explain what I did here. So the first thing I had to resolve that I didn't think about when I was given this exercise a moment ago is you probably would have expected one of these timestamps, or these stamps, I'll highlight it. That's year, month, day, space, hour, minute, second. That's 8 a.m. of tomorrow. The other one is the same value, but with a 9 instead of an 8. That's the other hour. Well, this might actually run, but malfunction. Let's test it. The reason is because the command line arguments are parsed with spaces. So there's actually 4 arguments being passed in. We obviously get a very bad data. If you got a -16 when you were doing this exercise, I'm still going to give you an A+. Because it would have been my job to point out the space parsing, and I didn't do that. But I cheated. I happen to know something you can do. That it's one of the valid date-time parse formats, of which there are many. Allows you to put a T, capital T, between the date and the time, which lets me implicitly remove those 2 spaces. Now I actually have 2 values on the command line, and the only space I'm going to highlight is right here in the middle. So once I put that T in there, now I went from 4 parameters, which was a weird set, to 2 that had the correct date stamp. So now I've got the correct parameters, and it runs correctly. So I saw some people were probably fighting that and actually created 2 different variables. That's fine too. You could do value 1 equals date time .UC now. just to start off with now. Now you wouldn't be actually doing the exercise as I specified it, but you would still be learning something. We could do add hours, 1, and then we could have a difference of value 2 minus value 1, and that value difference will also be approximately 1 hour. I say approximately because when you call UTC now, it's actually 2 different calls, and it's possible for a millisecond to elapse at just the right moment to where this becomes an hour and 1 second, or 59 minutes and 59 seconds. I would still give you an A. It would still be a fine solution. So you'll notice I'm using the subtraction operator in both cases. It's also possible. Sorry, I use the subtraction operator in both cases here. Let me comment out the one I'm not using. Some people found this. They were looking at value 2 and hit dot, and they scrolled down through and found subtract. There's actually a method called subtract, and if you read it, it says subtract a specified date and time from this instance. I could put value 1 as that parameter, run this, and I would expect it to perform the same way. And it does. You'll notice it's not identical. We did hit that problem where it's off by some small number of milliseconds because we asked for the UTC now twice. We asked for it here and here. Be ready for that in software, by the way. You might think that these 2 lines are executing so fast, because it's so fast for you as a human, that they'll have identical values. They may or they may not. It depends on the precision of the underlying call, and I would call it non-deterministic. It's a big fancy word for you might have a situation where these 2 are exactly an hour apart 1 million times that this application runs, and on the 1,000,001st, they're off by 5 milliseconds. So be ready for precision problems. They're really nasty because as I said, they're non-deterministic. They're sometimes hard to repeat locally. But if I run this again, we'll see if it's still off by 5. Now it's off by 4. That's what I mean by non-deterministic. The program is pretty close to being exactly right. Still off by 4. I'm not even sure those are milliseconds. Those are actually not milliseconds. Those might be either, I think those are tenths of a nanosecond. So, not too critical. We can actually fix that by reusing value 1. Now it'll actually be at exactly 1 hour. We won't see the 4 or the 5 at the end. There we go, 1 hour exactly. But the point of the exercise was to see if you could discover. I'm fixing this back to what it was, so it works per the spec that I had. See if you could discover that subtract works, or find that dot subtract, or some other creative way, and to see if you could parse and get these inputs to look right. If you didn't get this though, that's okay. That T is not a common practice. So if you were able to get it to work purely with hard-coded values or just instantiating those date times yourself, that's not bad. The point is did you know to use that dot syntax and try to figure out where the subtract was, or did you actually take a guess on the subtract operator? But that works. That gets the job done. Any questions about this exercise? And I'm going to give a couple other tips that I wanted to. But did anybody have questions about this? Nothing. Cool. Remember, I'll reemphasize this. You're going to be, because it's a statically typed language, you're going to be dealing with types all the time, and you're going to be converting all the time. Your best place to start is to start with the target type, whatever you're trying to convert to. So if I want to go from a string to a date time, type date time and hit dot and look for what you're looking for. Right? Look for a method or a property that's close to what you want. And hopefully you'll find something on the list. You'll be doing that a lot. The IntelliSense is very powerful. I use it all the time. Even after all these years, I'm still hitting dot and going, I wonder which one of these would be best for me today. Yeah?
Can you repeat that? You start with what and go to what? You start with what you're trying to change?
Yeah, you start with the target. So I'm going to clear all this off the screen because we've already determined that we've solved it. Let's pretend that you had a method or something, and its input value was a string, and it had, we'll put in just today's date. And you knew you wanted it to be a date time. Maybe you want to do that subtraction, or you want to add hours to it. Well, your first step must be to turn it from a string into a date time. You can't do input.add hours. That's a string. It's not a date. It's just a string. So there's no add on here. We need it to be a date time. So, oops. The tip was whatever you're trying to convert to is the thing you should look at for help. So in this case, I'm trying to go from a string to a date. So I'm going to do date time dot, and I'm going to search here for some sort of hint. It's not UTC now. It's not today. Ooh, parse. Right, parsing. And you can read the little tooltip here. Converts the string or representation of a date and time to its date time equivalent. It's exactly what I'm looking for. Open paren. I look at the parameter set. Also using this pop-up. It takes in a string. Well, that's my input. And there I have it. And I can confirm that this works with a breakpoint. I should be able to put my mouse over that date time. It will be today's date. Because I did not put a time on it, it'll be midnight. 2018 6/21 000000. So the tip is start whenever you need to do conversion, and you have to do conversion a lot in C#, and you have to do it manually yourself. The language won't convert for you. Start with where you're going to. Because whatever you're going to probably has some sort of from functionality on it. From a string, from an integer, from something else. I think for date time there's even a, let's look, from file time, from binary. I can probably even, I'll talk about the new keyword a little bit later in the course. I could do ticks. So I can create a new date time from scratch, out of nothingness, using ticks, which is operating system ticks. Not operating system. It's ticks from the moment of January 1st, year 1. Not 2001, but 2,000 years ago. And those ticks are actually operating system ticks, so it's not even 1 second. It's about 1 millisecond from midnight, January 1st, year 1. So there's lots of ways if you happen to have that number. Usually ticks is not a good example. We don't usually have that. But start with where you're going to and then look for methods on it or constructors. I'll talk about constructors later. I'm a little bit ahead of myself on that one. Any other questions about the exercise? Cool. I'm going to show a tip because I had a couple people in the audience here at Richmond ask, and I probably should have showed it before. You can see for the purposes of demonstration, I keep on typing code and deleting it. That might be kind of harmful for you now that I think about it because you want to save what you're typing. Let me show you how to create new projects that look the same in this same solution. So if you ever have something in your program.cs and you're proud of it, and you want to save it, maybe look at it tonight or Google, just save it, so you can review it in the future. You can go to the solution file in the Solution Explorer, right-click and do Add, New Project, and you can add in a new console app. I'll just call it Console App 2 because that's what it would probably be called for you. And it will, in this same solution, it'll put another console application right next to it. And all you have to do, you'll notice alpha's bold. See how? Let me put the highlight different. See how alpha's bold but Console App 2 is not bold? That's just how the solution's going to start, because you can only run one app at a time. If you right-click Console App 2 and do Set as Startup, you'll see now it's bold. If I press F5, actually I'm going to put a read key in here, so you'll see that it actually pauses. This is actually a brand new console app, completely isolated from the other one. So I can run this Hello World, and I have my old program.cs from before. So feel free to create those as I'm doing this if you don't want to delete your code. I'm deleting just because that's me, but you can have many console apps. You can have as many as you want, but you can only run one at a time. Don't forget to set as startup project. Question?
Can you do that one more time?
Yeah. I'll put a third one in. So remember, there are two console apps. One's called Alpha, one's Console App 2. let's pretend that both of these programming.cs's have code in them I don't want to delete, but I want to stay with the course. I go to the solution, right click, add new project, and I'm going to pick the same thing we've picked already this morning. See how it has .NET Core selected here? I'm going to do .NET App. You give it a name. I'm just going to call mine 3. Okay, now it will add it, but it's just sitting there orphaned and won't do anything. In order to actually run that one, I have to right click on it and do Set as Startup. And you'll notice at the top, Console App 3 near the green button, whatever I right click and do Set as Startup Project is the thing that's the green button changes to. So if I go back to Alpha, it changes to Alpha. That's what I'm actually running. Don't forget that Set as Startup. A lot of people accidentally forget that. You can create as many as you want, and they're isolated. It's like 3 different applications, all in one solution. Remember, the solution is just a collection of projects. It can be any arbitrary number if you're choosing. In this case, I have 3. But feel free to use that to save code, because I keep deleting it in front of you, but if you want to save it, you can create new apps as we go. Just a little tip, so you don't have to keep deleting your code. And I think that's it as far as tips. We're ready to move on to the next thing. Let me know if there are any questions about that. Okay, let's get into control of flow. I'm back in Alpha from my example here. So control of flow. We're going to talk about all the ways you can do, all the simple ways you can do logic in the code. So we've talked about data types. I'm going to do a new variable. Feel free to follow along, because you're going to want some muscle memory now. I'll just have a variable. We'll call it approved. Maybe we're part of some project. We're part of some project there where we have approved. And I'm going to set it to true. Now it'll be green squigglied potentially for you. That just means we haven't used it yet. That's fine. Its variable type is Boolean, which, as we all know, is a true or false. So the very first thing is something you've already seen in JavaScript. It's very straightforward. There's the if statement. If statements are always have parentheses. Don't forget the parentheses. We can say if approved. And it does require the curly brackets. You'll know how fast it's so habitual for me now. You can just do the open curly and press enter. It creates the closed curly and gets it on a new line for you. And I'll do a right line just so we all know it works. Yes. If we run this, we will see a yes. So we're saying if approved, then write yes on the screen. We see our yes, that's working. Some people also do this. That actually works. However, many teams you work on will frown upon that because it's a lot of extra code. The if statement just takes the Boolean value and evaluates it as is. You don't have to actually check if it's equal to true. JavaScript has triple equals. That has no place in C#, so don't ever type it. It's not there, it doesn't exist. The reason for its existence in JavaScript does not apply to a statically typed language, so there is no such thing. This double equals is more synonymous with triple equals, but there's really nothing more to think about that. So if true, that. Obviously, if I set this to false, we will not see that line. So the ifs are what you've already seen. The only really cosmetic difference, generally in JavaScript, the open curly bracket stays on the same line as the if, but that's not the convention, I use the word convention on purpose, of C#. Remember, the computer doesn't care, but most C# developers do. We usually do open curlies. It is possible with if statements, if they only have one expression, you can remove the curlies completely and it will work the same. As long as it's only one line, this will work just the same as I had it with open and curly braces. There's no difference in performance. It's all the same code, works the same. Different teams have different preferences on that coding style. You can actually also put it on the same line. That's the same. Remember, white space doesn't matter to the computer. My style is to always include the curly braces, so I'm going to put them back on. All right. Obviously, with an else, we have, with ifs, we have elses. These work just as you would expect. There's nothing really magical about C#. Yes and no. So it'll say yes this time. I'll change it to false, and then it'll say no. So it says yes. I'm going through these rather quickly because they're pretty much similar to what you've probably already learned. So far, we're not deviating much from the JavaScript style. This will say no because our value is false. No. Works perfectly. Oh, I didn't see your question. Yes?
If you left it as like true and just put an exclamation point in front of the true, it would like print out no, right?
Correct. He's asking about the, I always call it bang, but the exclamation point, yes, that does invert the logic. So the value, the variable is true, but I'm saying if not true, so this will say no. So that does work. You can do that with any Boolean expression in the language. I'm using a Boolean variable, but any Boolean expression, which I'll go into deeper later, it works as well. Yeah, it's a good question. It's subtle, but that works the same. Good question. Yes, question?
Can a Boolean also take the arguments 0 and 1, like in JavaScript, or can it only be true or false?
True or false?
That's it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a very strict
So
language.
if you said it was equal to 1 or 0, then it would think it's an integer?
Repeat the question, just to add the JavaScript truth in use question.
So the question was about using 0 or 1 for Booleans, and my response is no, it's got to be true or false. In C#, once again, you're always going to find that the types here are much more strict. It's going to be either true or false. If you put a 1 here, kind of like tSQL or something, you'll see we get red squiggles on the next thing because ifs must evaluate a Boolean something, either an expression or variable, and if you put your mouse over it, cannot implicitly convert type int to bool. That's not the same in something like tSQL we talked about last week. It's perfectly happy with 1s, 0s, and 1s. That's its actually native preference. But no, this is very strict. It's either true or false, period. There are other types I'll talk about later that can make that that'll have a slightly different answer. But for Booleans, it's true or false. Really there's no flexibility here. The types in a statically typed language are very strict. Your hands are tied. It better be true or false. All right, so we have if and else, and that's pretty straightforward. We also have something just like JavaScript, we have switch. And I'm actually going to change the code a little bit. We've talked about Booleans. I'm going to change to a number. I'll just do the number 2. So I can switch on value. Once again, we have to use open paren, close paren for what's being evaluated. We use the curly brackets to open up the switch block. We can do case statements. This is similar, but I'm not sure if it's identical to JavaScript. So we'll do case 1. I'll put in 3 cases. And I am just going to do console.writeLine. And I'm going to do the string version of 1. Now, switches in C# are a little bit weird. Some other languages let you do some interesting expressions in case statements, not in C#. This is a very truncated version of a switch. There's really not much to them. They're very simple constructs, and they're prohibited from being more advanced. So I can switch on a value, but my cases have to be what we call literals. They have to be actual literal values known at compile time. I could not put like a call to a method in here. Just remember that if you ever type in a switch and you start getting this, I forgot what the error message is, but it'll basically tell you it's got to be a literal. So we'll do the other cases. I'm going to do 2 and 3, so if you want to try to race ahead of me, feel free. I'll use copy and paste, see if I can win the race. I'm going to do 1, 2, and 3. 3. So I have an integer value of 1, I switch on it, and then I say scan all the cases, and when you find a match, let's run that. Don't forget to put these breaks in. If you don't put the break in, you'll get an error message about fall through or something like that. C# is very strict in its cases. You have to break out of every case block explicitly with a break statement. You can also do exceptions, but I'll be talking about exceptions later. So if I run this, we'll see the word to, if I wrote it correctly. 2. Excellent. You can kind of think of switches kind of like an if-else-if, except if-else-if supports expressions, more complex expressions. Switches they got to be constrained to these literal values. Last thing I'll say about switches, they have a default block. I'm going to go ahead and write the code and then explain it. Bad value. Default is executed if none of the cases match. So if I change that value to 99, the default gets hit and we'll see bad value. Now I'm going to give you an opinion that I hope you'll distrust me on. All switches I type have a default block, period. It's about code maintenance, and I won't give a long lecture on code maintainability. I always have a default block, and in almost all cases I throw exceptions. I'll talk about what that means in a few minutes, a little bit later today at least. The reason is about code maintenance. So if it becomes okay for a value 4 to exist, but you don't have a default block, you could end up with some bugs. Let me leave it that way and go ahead and answer this question. Question?
Is that case number 1 or case where value is equal to 1?
The question is that like a case identifier or case value? It's a value.
Okay.
So I am saying when I switch on value, that's the left side of a double equals. So if equals 1, if equals 2, if equals 3. I can improve. You actually raise a good point. I'll improve this with a better example. I'll make it a string, and I'll have to refactor this because of the types. Banana. You'll see I get red squigglies on those values now. Cannot convert from int to string. Oops. So I'll do apple, banana, and my favorite, strawberry. And see now it all builds, and this would actually run, and I would see 2, the word 2, TWO, because that's what I'm console right lining. It's a good question though. Those were not like identifiers for something. They're actual values on the left and right of a quality comparison. Follow-up question?
Yes.
Okay.
Is your string value case sensitive when you type it in?
Ooh, excellent question. The question is, are the strings case sensitive? Absolutely. They are case sensitive, and this is very much unlike T-SQL, which is case insensitive by default and trailing white space insensitive. If I put a lowercase b on banana, it will not match any case and will fall through to the default block. I'll see bad value, because that lowercase b banana is not the same as uppercase b. Even if I have an uppercase b and put a space on the end of it, those strings are not considered equal. Therefore, it's still a bad value. So even if I get the casing correct but have the white space wrong, I will get bad value. So the strings must be perfectly identical. Strings in C# are stored as Unicode and support lots of values and must be identical. Question?
How would you pass like an image SRC? Did you pass that through that, like provide different images in each of the cases?
You're passing, you say images?
Images, like an image.
So the question is about passing images in. I've never done that. If you mean images as in a byte array, you can, but it won't work the way you're thinking. I'm going to get later in the course to equality in C#. Equality is a big painful thing, but although there is an image data type, that would probably not work the way you're expecting. And even if you converted it to a byte array, I haven't talked about arrays very much yet, that would probably not work well either. So in general, I would probably opt for some other solution than using a switch or even an if. You're probably trying to compare something else. And a few days from now, I'll be talking about one way to do that. That's actually a very advanced question. So not yet. We'll get to that though. And that's pretty much it for switches. If you come from other languages, the real thing that trips people up is that these case statements are literals. They have to be literals. They can't be advanced expressions. Most languages support that. C# does not. If you need advanced expressions, you do an if and an else if. Although I didn't show it, I'll go ahead and type a quick one. You don't need to follow along. I'm just showing you it's possible. One second. You can do else ifs. You see it's gray here because I'm not really doing any meaningful logic, but else ifs do exist. Cases are basically simplified versions of that. Question?
So the question from Winston is there something similar to percentage from SQL, like wildcard and C#?
So the question is you guys heard it here. I don't need to repeat it for here. are there wildcards for string comparison? I'm going to get into string comparison stuff later. It's actually a kind of a first-class subject in and of itself. Yes, we can do all sorts of very powerful things in C# with strings, but it's not the percent operator. There is no like operator. I forgot when I'm going to cover that, but I think it's going to be pretty soon. It's actually after the next exercise, so I'll cover it then. Yeah, the string. When you compare something like T-SQL I showed last week, it has a few string things you can do, equality and a little bit of wildcard with the like operator. C# string manipulation is incredibly powerful. I could fill a whole day on strings. I won't, but I could. So we got all those bases are covered. I'll cover the basics. Any other questions about switch? Cool. So then we have loops. Let's talk about the many ways we can loop. Lots of ways to loop in C#. We use them in different ways. Let's do while. Let me do a variable just so we can prove this. So value equals true. Actually, I changed that to approved. Do feel free to follow along this point. I will have an exercise where you're going to have to do loops. That's a hint to how to solve the exercise. So you might want to follow along. So I can do while approved. And I could do lots of code here. I'll do oops. Now if I run this, I suggest you not run it. I'm just going to run it myself just to show you. So I have a Boolean value of true, and I'm saying while true, let's write to the console. But I'm never setting it to false. I'm going to run mine. You can, but I would suggest you not, depending on the power of your machine. This is now in an infinite loop. It's of course very bad in a production app, but this will loop for all of eternity. You can see it's kind of twitching down here, but it's writing as fast as it can. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if one of my CPUs is busy at the moment. We'll see. In fact, I might even kill the stream. I should probably stop it. Yeah, that's probably a bad idea. Yeah, let me stop it. The streaming software is going to die. So obviously that's bad. If it did break, let me know.
It's so good.
It didn't start recording enough. Oh well, that was very bad. What I did was bad. We can easily break out of the loop in many ways. So it's a while loop. It functions like you say, like you would guess. As long as that value is true, it does it again. So it's true initially, it writes the line, comes back to the while, it's still true, writes the line, still true, writes the line, still true, writes the line, and it goes on forever. But I can set that approved equal to false, and it will write in the loop only once, and it exits the loop quietly and happily. So while true, it loops. That's one way to loop. Let's talk about getting out of a loop. In all of the loop mechanisms I'm going to show you, you can break out of a loop. The key word is break. It's just a way to say stop looping. It won't even try to reevaluate that approved. It just stops after the first loop iteration. You can break out of all the loops I'm going to show you. I'm going to show you 1, 2, 3, 4 of them. So this is the first one. Oh, I'm sorry, I have a typo in that string, don't I? Bink. Fixed. So that's one way to loop. I'll leave that one on the screen. There's also a do. While approved. A lot of people get confused between these two, but it's pretty straightforward. The difference between these two is that it's actually chronologically reads from top to bottom. It evaluates this Boolean value in the while loop immediately and then jumps into the loop if it's true. The do is a little different. The do makes this first write line occur and then evaluates the while. So do always executes the body once, at least once. The while only executes if it was true from the very beginning. So these two things are two different ways to loop in C#. They're very similar. The only fundamental difference you want to remember is the do's body always executes once. And that reads from top to bottom. You can kind of read this from top to bottom. It looks really logical. Okay, we see the do keyword. We do this work once, always. And then only if that approved is true do we try again. And I will demonstrate the difference. I'm going to put a break in so I don't kill the stream, kill anything. So it's true in both cases. And I've numbered the loops. I have the while loop at the top and the do at the bottom. I can't get all this code on the screen. Both of these iterated once. Of course, I'm breaking out of them, so that's actually not the greatest example. Let me make this a better example, and then I'll run that again. I'm changing the breaks to approved equals false. So it starts off true. The while loop will execute once. In fact, I'm going to name that better. I'm going to make the string better. This is the while loop. I'll name this one so it's easier to read when I run the application. So approved is true. We'll loop through once. We'll print while loop. We'll set it to false. It evaluates the while again and exits. So we'll see while loop one time. The do will execute once as well. It'll print the do loop, set it to false, and then evaluate and choose not to loop. In both cases, I think we'll see each one of them one time. These are sort of the unconstrained loops, is what I like to call them, where you're kind of in control of when they end. And in fact, you need to be aware that with whiles and do's, if you don't make an active decision to exit the loop, then it goes into an infinite loop. So I would just say, be a little bit careful with them, test them, make sure there's no scenario where the evaluation that occurs in the while might never become true. It will always stay in some false state, because then you'll end up with an infinite loop. Question?
The approved equals false and break.
Yes.
Do they do the same? They don't do the same thing.
So the question is setting approved equal to false and breaking the same thing? As far as the effect in this very simple code I've written, the answer is yes, but they are different functionalities. And it's about having side effects. I'll see if I can answer this question, but if I lose a few people, it's okay. I'm just trying to answer the question directly. The difference is break just breaks. So imagine if these two false settings were breaks, they break immediately. No code in them runs, and it does not reevaluate the whiles in either case. But setting approved to false does reevaluate the whiles. Right? Now that doesn't matter for a Boolean, but I could have an expression in here that calls a method that does work, like hits a database.
Right.
And so they would then become fundamentally very different activities. Although both of them would iterate only once, one of them literally breaks out a loop and keeps executing C#, which is a highly performant event. The other might hit a database again. So it would hit the database one too many times.
Okay.
So although they accomplish the same goal, they are dissimilar in how the while is evaluated. In this example, because I'm just using a plain old Boolean, there's no real difference.
So it's taking the false and going out and then sticking it back into var approved. And
Yes.
then running it again.
Yes.
And so just, okay, got it.
Yes, when I set this, and I'm doing this for Winston, when I set this approved to false, it's setting that original variable to false. There's not like a second copy or anything. It's the original, which means the moment it gets reevaluated at the end of that do, or when it's evaluated at the beginning of the next while iteration, it's now false, then it stops looping. It won't execute the body of the loop again. Right? These are the unconstrained, there's the two unconstrained loops in C#, where you have the risk of a infinite loop, because if you think about it, pretend this was more complicated code, it'd be so easy to have an if and an else if and switches, and one of those branches does not set approved to false nor break. I'm sorry, I'm running the code, so it won't break out. In which case, there is a path in your loop that results in infinity. So you got to be careful about how much logic you put in here. It could get so complex that you miss a permutation. You could have 3 ifs nested, which is 2 to the 3 power combinations. That's 8 potential paths. And if on path 7 you don't break out a loop, when a customer hits that path 7, even if it's a rare case, it'll go infinite loop right there. So be careful about that. There was a question. I saw a hand in the back. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna say, if you put var in front of approved, it would be like making a new approved, right? That's like local to the loop.
Ooh, good question. Let me type it. So the question was using var in the loop. His question's about scope, something we always would deal with in all programming languages. What is the scope of a variable? This is actually a great time to ask this question. The question was, what would I do if I had a var approved somewhere in the body of the loop? Well, you can tell the language hates that. If you put your mouse over it, the variable approved is assigned, but oh, hang on. Let's actually make this a good test. So the way this works, I just want to mention this. When you get red squigglies, Visual Studio shows you the first thing it doesn't like about the variable. It doesn't necessarily show you all the problems. So I had to add this if. Now I'm going to put the mouse over it and get to your actual question. A local parameter name approved cannot be declared in this scope because that name is used in an enclosing local scope to define a local or a parameter. It's a very long sentence, lots of big words in it. What it's saying is, it already exists here. No, you cannot use var to declare a new one. If you want to set the original, you don't include var, but var, this works. This is totally fine because you're resetting the original. But no, you cannot, in a smaller scope that can still see the outer scope, redeclare a variable of the same name. In those cases, you'll get red squigglies. Multiple questions. Yours was up a second earlier.
Could you inside the first while loop declare a variable, and inside the second do loop declare the same variable, like a new one, like var approved to, yeah, there you go.
I'm just going to do it. This is fine.
So those two scopes are separate.
Yeah.
You just can't have something declared outside the scope and then the same thing inside.
So the explicit question was, could I put a new variable in the scope of the body of one loop and have that be exclusive to the other? This is allowed because if you remember that original error message, it talked about the enclosing scope and outer. This can be seen by anything deeper than that. But siblings, which is what I would call these two loops, they have different scopes. This is an entire scope in and of itself, as is this. They can see the entire outer scope, which includes that approved, but they get their own local variables, the approved to. So this approved to, you can even see that Visual Studio is very smart. If I put my cursor in approved to, it highlights the other one of that name in the current scope, but not the two at the bottom. And the inverse is true. If I click the two at the bottom, it knows those two are the same approved to, and the other one is different. This is allowed because they're siblings and they're separate. But in neither case can I put in a new approved because the inner can always see all the outers, effectively infinitely up. You've had your hand up a while.
So, before you change it to 2, that would be like saying x is equal to 3 and 4 at the same time. Then you can't do that because one variable can't be 2 values.
If the question is one variable cannot be 2 values, yeah, definitely not. It's one thing at a time. Yeah. Yeah, there are complex types, which I will be talking about in this course, but right now I'm keeping it simple. When we're dealing with simple things like integers and dates and booleans, you can only step on top of the old value. You can only replace it.
Of the same type.
Of the same type.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's always true in C#. I'm just going to keep on harping on it. The types are not flexible. So you can do a false. You can do anything that results in a false. So you could do an expression. To this true, I could change to 1 equals 1. That's technically an expression. This would be terrible code to write, so don't ever write it. But because 1 does equal 1, that's true. The type of approved stays Boolean. But that's a ridiculous piece of code to write. So let's put it back the way it was. But that would always stomp on the value. Question about loops? About these two kinds? Those are used pretty often, but I find they're actually not the most popular or the most commonly used. Let's talk about the other two. The other two big ones. Feel free to save your code and move on to a new program.cs. Like always, I'm going to just nuke this back to a clean slate, and talk about something new. You're going to recognize this. This is very similar to what you've probably seen. I assume we've done loops in JavaScript. Yeah. This is a for loop. It takes on the same sort of structure you've seen in JavaScript. Value plus I, toString. I'm just setting up some code. Please do follow along. I'm going to go ahead and just type it all and then explain it while you're typing. So the for loop is just really like the JavaScript one. You do declare a variable in it, which you'll be iterating over. And it's you don't miss these are semicolons. They're not colons, in case my screen resolution is not the best. So var I equals 0. So we're initializing I as an integer equal to 0. We loop as long as I is less than 5, and we increment that I on every loop. It's just the same as JavaScript. So when I run this, if I have typed it correctly, you can see I'm just writing to the console, so we can demonstrate how this works. We should see values 0 through 4, right? Because it's 0 based, and I am doing the addition operator, which allows us to concatenate strings. So I am just doing value and then I.toString. I'll run it. I'll make sure I'll keep the code visible on the screen, but I want to run it for those who are keeping up. We get 5 values: 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. That's a simple for loop. It's just like JavaScript. It's just like C++. This is really very similar to many other of the C style languages like Java. And I'm assuming if you've done that in JavaScript, I don't got to go over it anymore. Are there any questions on this that might be C# specific? They're really, it's very similar. Not only does it type similar, it runs similarly. Question?
I've noticed a couple times is single quotes and double quotes. They're very specific here too.
Yes. So the question is about single quotes versus double quotes. In C#, those mean very different things. We're not to the string part of this yet, but I will go ahead and mention it because you've asked. Double quotes are used for strings. Okay, that's Unicode strings, case sensitive, white space counts, all the stuff I've talked about strings already. Single quotes are for characters, and the abbreviation of the type in C# is char. So I'm going to do C equals 5. If I put my mouse over C, its type is char for character. A character is what it sounds like. It's a single character. It's a single Unicode character. The long and short of your question is most C# developers only know strings exist. Many veterans do not know characters exist. They really don't know. They might go their entire career and never type in the single quote. I've seen people who don't know it. They just don't know. Harper looks surprised. I've met them and I'm like, yeah, it's just a character array, right? You can convert it to character array, and there wasn't an understanding there.
You have to pass that into joins and all different things, like string joins. I mean, it's like a parameter some places. You have to use it.
People go a very long distance without knowing. I've met more than one. I'm not just picking out one poor schmo. It's pretty common. Some people are just not from that world. They just think of all strings are created equal, strings are strings, blah, blah, blah. But under the hood, there's characters.
Yeah,
so it's one character at a time.
Before it hasn't really mattered. It's choking up.
Yeah, and so you can actually do things. So we're talking, in fact, this is actually a great segue. This is a great segue.
String is just an array of characters.
Exactly. String, Harper just said a string is an array of characters, and he is correct. So I'm actually going to leave this 4 on the screen. Any other questions about 4? Almost.
Yeah, it's not about 4, it's about strings.
Okay, just hold on to it. I promise it's after this next exercise. I love that people are eager. So let me move on to the this one last loop kind, and this is a great segue from your question actually. For each. So for each allows us to loop over anything. Now my initial goal was to talk about args, so let's do that. Now I believe for each exists in JavaScript, and it's not like this. That's about iterating over the properties of an object, and this is different enough. I want you to think of this for each as somewhat different. The for is similar, but not for each. So the for each in C# iterates over anything that we call IEnumerable. In a few days from now, I'm going to talk about what that means. But it loops over anything in the framework that's been labeled as being enumerable. And the good news is everything from Microsoft is already enumerable. All the sets are enumerable. Period. So in this case, there's a string array passed in to our console. Remember, if I remember correctly, we ended on dates, didn't we? Let me look at the debug here real quick. Just curious. Yeah, we have the 2 dates. Remember, I still have those old parameters being passed in. So this for each would iterate over each one of the string values in that string array, and I can do something with one of them at a time. Starts at the first one, just goes all the way through it. I don't need to know its index, right? I can just immediately write it out. I'm going to get back to strings in a moment. I am going to talk more about that. So I can do console write line on just one of those args. So if I press F5 right now, remember we're passing in, I have my alpha app here. We're passing in those 2 date strings. We're not converting them. It's just the raw strings that were passed in. We will loop over all those arguments and print all of them. There are, if I remember correctly, I did 2 of them, and it has the, oh, I'm still printing out the old values, but my application still works. I have those 2 date parameters passed in. So these are the raw values that are in that debug screen. And I've looped over all of them, there are 2, and I can do something with one at a time. So we use for each whenever we have a set, and we know we want to touch one at a time. We want to know about one at a time, we want to operate on one at a time, we want to read one at a time, we want to do something one at a time. For each is actually your most common loop in my experience in C#. Fors are pretty common. But as far as usage in real line of business projects, I'm using for each all the time. Okay, both of these allow you to break out early if you wanted to. That works. I'm not going to leave that in there. Was there a question?
I was just going to say, so I understand what args is. So it's a string array coming in from the main thing. What is var arg though? Is that specially named? Does that arg have to be named that way? Or?
Great question. The question is about this var arg. What does that mean? So I'm going to put my cursor on args here so we can see it's the same one. We're looping over that original array. And the syntax is always just going to be var and any variable name I want. I'll call it anything in and that IEnumerable type. So in this case, I actually know what they should be. So this should actually be a date string. That's actually a better variable name because I know what it's supposed to be. It also makes this code a little bit easier to read. And so we could actually use a technique we already know about. Right? We could go ahead and parse that. Datetime.parse date string. Date string. You'll notice I use that in IntelliSense all the time. You'll notice I almost never finish typing like a variable name. I just start, IntelliSense, I hit tab, or I hit close parent, or I hit dot, and I'm ready to go. That's muscle memory. You'll just get that with time, but I'm just sort of reemphasizing the power of what is a very good IDE. Visual Studio is very powerful. So then I could write, I could adjust that date. You can set a variable equal to itself by modifying it. That is allowed. So I'm going to add, oops, month, there we go. I'm going to add 6 months to whatever was passed in and print out the string version of it. So let me explain what I typed and why. So I'm going to comment out the first loop because I want the output on my console to be a little bit prettier and limited. So what have I done here? We have a command line for our console app. People are passing in 2 dates. We're going to loop over each of them, right? Each of them is the string version of a date. So I decided to name that variable date string. I could have named it anything I wanted. I take that string and parse it. We've already seen parsing. You did an exercise on parsing. I adjust that date. This equals just stomps on the original value, as I mentioned earlier. So we take that original date, we add 6 months to it, and overwrite the value. This works. There's no magic here. There's setting a variable over and over based on versions of itself is totally fine. It's just the computer basically just calculates this value and then overwrites it. No big deal. And then I'm writing the string version of that. So if I run this, I should see both of our parameters again, but instead of seeing their original values with that T, they should be a full date timestamp in the format that .NET likes it, and they'll also be incremented by 6 months. This should be December 22nd. There it is, December 22nd, 8 a.m. and 9 a.m. So it took our original values, once again, took the original values that were in the debug, converted them to dates, added 6 months, and wrote them both. And that's what for each does. It loops over the whole set. and I say whole set, you can break out of it early. I could also put the break keyword in here and it would break out after only listing one of them. Question over here?
Is there a reason the dates would show up formatted differently on different computers?
So the question is there a reason that the dates would show up differently on different computers? Yes. The .NET framework sits on top of the operating system. At the operating system level, you can set formats for,
Okay.
So some people prefer 24-hour time, some people don't. Depending on what country you're in, some countries do day, month, year. So January 1st January 1st is a bad example. January 2nd in the two date formats is backwards. For us, it would be February 2nd. Usually in America, it's month, day, but it could be backwards. They can set that, and yes, this toString on this date that I'm doing does care about lots of things, and one of them is the local settings in that machine. There are some advanced things we can do to force it. So that should actually strike you in the gut a little bit. That should be a little bit scary. Like, wait a second, so my app runs on different machines, it'll produce different results? Well, yes. Yes, it will. Sometimes that's what you want. Sometimes the whole point is to show it in the person's preferred format, and that's perfectly fine. You leave it as is. There are ways to get around that if you do need to force the type. And I'm not going to go deep into this, but there's an overload for toString where you can specify custom types. And I'm going to hit up MSDN real quick just to show you.
I think it'll start to do IntelliSense on it, actually.
Does it do that now?
In the
Gotcha.
screen, yeah.
So I'm going to do C# space date time. I'm going to do custom format. Let's see if I can get a first hit. Custom format on the old Google. Microsoft Docs, first hit. I'll open it in a new tab in case it's not what I want. First off, I want you to notice how long this article is. This is the little scroll bar. Notice these lowercase d's, lots of d's, f's, capital F's, g's, h's, k's, m's, s's, r's, y's. Goodness, it's got a lot of stuff in there. Yes, it has huge amounts of things. You can override this toString and specify, for example, I'm going to do hyphen. Now, let me do a weird character. Caret, year. Let's see what that does. There it is. So I happen to just know that capital M, two M's together, is month, numeric. The caret is just a character I typed for fun, and lowercase y's, 4 of them, is the year. So if you think about it, if you look at this article and look at all the crazy format options available to you, and combine it with the fact this is a string that I can format in any way I want, what you realize is if you run into a situation where that person's machine is displaying a date differently and it's critical to your app that they be identical, you can even specify custom formats. Now in general you don't do that. Generally you pick some sort of ISO format, something that the whole planet's agreed on is the way to do it, and you go with that one. But the sky is the limit here. As I mentioned before, string manipulation and date manipulation in C# is powerful. Extremely powerful. Lots of options. More than I could cover in this course. Was that a question? Okay. Just a stretch?
Yeah.
Nice. Cool. So that's the for each. We actually had somebody asked a moment ago about strings. Strings are actually just arrays. It's actually possible to... this might be possible. I don't remember if this is possible. It's not giving me a red squiggly. Let's see if it works. I don't do it often, but it looks like it's very happy with that. See if we see TEST vertical. We do. So this is kind of a merge of the gentleman's question from earlier. Strings in .NET are actually just a character array under the hood. Most C# developers don't know that, but you can tell that it's true because you can for each over it. And what you end up with is this variable C. If I put my mouse over it, it's of type char, which is character, and I can write one at a time. So TEST is being written vertically because it's basically pivoted the statement. I've looped over T and then E and then S and then T, and I wrote one line at a time, so it ends up vertically aligned. But that's all they are under the hood. There's a bunch of characters, Unicode characters.
Did you say how you selected and commented out that section?
Yeah, I commented out the date stuff. I wanted to show the string
You
separate.
selected it and then you pressed a button?
To do what? Oh, for the commenting?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, you gotta ask me this stuff.
I did.
So you can good. You can do sets of comments in Visual Studio. This also works in VS Code. If you hold Control K and then C, that's Control K, Control C. They call that a chord. You have to do multiple hotkeys.
Yeah, it's while you're holding control, so it's not like separate. It's hold down
Yeah.
control and then do K and then C while you're still holding control.
Yeah. And Control K, Control U undoes it.
Oh, cool. Sorry.
No, you're good.
You undoes it?
Yeah, U C. Wait, hang on. Let me do it. It's all muscle memory. It's KU. Sorry. It's muscle
I
memory.
don't even know what they are.
I don't know what they are. It's
Yeah.
so weird. Control K, Control C is comment. Control K, Control U is uncomment. You'll see me do that often. I mean, I'm always working with large sets of code. Got to comment, uncomment, huge sets. Like I said, I think that also works in VS Code. I think it's even the same keys.
A lot of times in your menu, if you go to do something like that, comment, it'll show you the keyboard command in the thing.
Yeah, he's pointing out that there's hints here. So refactor, no. Advanced. Comment select, no, not selection. I don't remember where I found it. It's been so many years since I looked. Harper's point was sometimes the hotkeys are on the menus. As you can see, here's a good example, although this is not where the Control K is. I've forgotten where that is. It's been so long
Wherever
since
you
I
see
looked.
that Control plus E comma C, that's a chord. That's where you have to do two kind of keys at once.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, that's so I have multiple hotkeys set up for that. Yes. Control E C. Well, let's try that. Control E C. That does do the same thing. So my Control K must come from a older version of Visual Studio, but they must have kept the old hotkey chord. Interesting. All right, so we got the for each. Any question about the for each that I've typed here that I'm going to uncomment?
You said for each, there's one at a time. One.
Yep.
Can you explain them? Just
Yeah. So just wanted another explanation. For each is always var something in something. And that second one, which is args, must be what we call enumerable. I'll get to that later in the course. Just anything that's a set. In a case, an array is a set. Array is many things. It could be 0, but it's some in number. So we could pass any number of args. In this case, we're passing in 2. Because it's a set, I can for each over it, and I'm just doing var any variable name in args. And that the type of that variable will always be this original type. Right? Was that helpful? Is that good? Good question. We'll be doing lots of loops in the course. You're going to see me using for eaches all the time.
And in IntelliSense is very helpful there too. You can just type FOR and hit tab usually, and it'll kind of create that sort of loop for you. Put your cursor like where it's supposed to, and that kind of thing.
I don't know what you're talking about, but I'll trust you. I don't have that one muscle
Yeah,
memory.
sure, so.
I might not have it set up like that, or have the snippet or whatever. So just to reemphasize, you can always break out early. So because I'm putting a break in the for each, we're only going to see the first date, which was, this will be December 22nd. Oh, well, I've already truncated how it prints it, so December of 2018. But we only see one. That's the point here, because I broke out early. I'm also going to point out that there's another keyword. It doesn't really make sense here, but sometimes you'll have, I'll just write an example, just to show it working. This won't execute. So there's a sibling to the break command. So break exits the loop immediately and never iterates again. Continue breaks out of the current iteration and goes to the next one. Okay, so continue is good, and it's only really used if you have like an if statement or some sort of logic, you're doing stuff. If you do continue, it won't execute the stuff after it. Now I've contrived this kind of a lame example, but I'm saying if true continue, you'll even notice Visual Studio is unhappy. It makes this gray. Unreachable code detected. that console write line that says this won't execute, as it says, won't execute. But we will see both dates. So let me get the code on the screen. So once again, we're looping over 2 arguments, convert to date, add the months, write the line, then we continue. The continue just comes back up to the top of the loop and keeps going. And you'll use this generally if you have logic. There'll be times in your loops where you need to get something done in a certain context in case there's some logic that's true at some moment. And then you want to keep going and not do other code. But in other iterations, that'll result in a false. It will be if false effectively. The continue won't run, and we will run those latter lines. So break exits the loop entirely, continue continues with the next iteration. And those are the only 2 special keywords that we use in loops. Break and continue work in all of the loop types. I just waited to the end to show you continue. And I'll just make the verbal comment. It's possible to nest loops very deep. I'm just going to ask you not to. Code gets really hard when it's nested very deep. The technique to deal with that is to create more methods. But be careful with situations where you've got one outer loop, you've got one inner loop. It does stuff, and you got to do here with a while, and here we've got another for each. It gets really hard to read, and it gets really confusing for your teammates. If you find yourself tabbing in really deep like this, it might be time to create a new method and bury that loop in another method. You can still write the logic, but just be careful. I've looked at code before where they're so deep that most of this left side of the screen is white space and all the code is pushed very far off to the right, and people are generally going to frown upon that. It's hard to read. They can't read your code. Even if it works correctly, they're going to ask you to change it. I've even been on teams where there are rules that you cannot have 2 in one method, where you cannot go more than 1 level deep. Those are pretty rigorous. Those are rare teams, but I'm okay with that rigorous nature because nested loops are a pain. Any questions about loops? Anything about ifs, else switches, while, do, for each, break, or continue? This is all about control of flow and looping. All right, we're going to do an exercise. I'll leave that on the screen, even though it's I'll pull off the nested loops. I'll leave the good part. Let me look at my notes here, and I'll describe the next exercise. Feel free to create a new app for this, a new console, if you want. This is going to be a console application that adds integers together that were passed in as command line parameters. So, it's going to take in command line parameters any number. Instead of last time where we knew it was going to be 2, it's going to be any number. That number could be as small as 0. And let's see if I can complicate it a little bit. It's going to add those together. So if you passed in 1, 2, 3, I want the console to print out 6. 1 plus 2 plus 3. All right. It does need to be able to handle if there are no arguments. In such a case, it should print out 0. Right? No argument should be a 0. And get that working as it is. So that's kind of exercise phase 1. As an addition to that, what I want you to do is make it tolerant of bad values passed in. So 1, 2, zebra 3 would result in 6. The zebra gets cast out. Now that's just the phase 2. Get the first one working. Just get it done, be happy with it, and then try that more advanced technique there at the end. And that's it. That one should be pretty short. I'm going to stop the stream.